This is the train station for Amtrak. It was the Burlington Railroad back in the 50s and 60s. 50s probably, maybe. I can't remember when they were sold out to the Burlington. That was the Northern, and it merged with the Northern. Anyway, this is where people would come in and get off the train, and it was quite nice in the 1950s. We took a couple of trips on the train. Remember the sights, the smells, and so forth. Probably looks nothing like that. These covered areas. Well, they used to be covered. Now they're just the steel is all that's left. Anyway, there used to be people that would come out and unload your bags off the train, and the east would use the tracks going west would use the near trails here, and the tracks on the far side would be the trains going east. There are no can't pick up any of the smells that I smelled back then. When I worked for the railroad back in 1966, the railroads were beginning to install train tracks that are a quarter mile long. Now, you have to understand how high the rails are. They stand about 10 inches tall off of the wood, and they would be loaded onto multiple flat cars, and then a crane on the other track would just start setting an end off, and then they would just kind of move the train forward and use the crane when necessary to unload the track, and it would eventually just fall off the car. Then they had other very heavy equipment that would start picking it up and setting it on the tracks, on the ties. Now they're still using creosoted ties here, which back when I was working on the railroad, they were still using creosoted ties. But now they're starting to use other types of ties, including cement, reinforced cement ties that are made someplace else and brought in. Anyway, the building looks the same as it did back in the 50s, the 60s. The room in there, it was the waiting room. There were several of those kinds of hand cars or full car things they would bring out and get the luggage off the train. Air traffic was still pretty expensive back then, and so people that traveled, well, they didn't have a whole lot of money. Plus, the airplanes didn't hold nearly as many people as they do now. Back then, it was probably 35 or 40 people on an airplane, and now can be up to 100 plus, even over 200 in a lot of cases. So this looks pretty much the same way as it did when I was 10 years old. The thing I remember about this place back in the 50s was out front there was a fountain. This building there looks like a little home. I think it had something to do with the railroad people. Anyway, it was there. Kind of avoided the sledgehammer. I finally found this watering trough. It's a horse watering trough. It's been a lot of places in town. It's now here. The first place I ever saw this was at Wildwood Park. It's out, I think it's west of town, out Finley Street. Anyway, it was moved from the Wildwood Park to over in the little park that's goes up around the library, and essentially it's over there by the Ottumwa Hotel, kind of out to the back of it. Anyway, it was located at the library for a long time, or in that little park. And then it's been downtown by the Fidelity Savings Bank. Let's see, where else has it been? Oh, it's been over by the Market Street Bridge on the south side of it. It's probably been other places. In the past 10 or 15 years, I haven't visited Ottumwa nearly as much as I did prior to that, when my parents were living here and still living. Anyway, I was going around here to the fountain, which was here then, or one just like it. And I remember sitting on the edge of it before the train got here, getting my hands cool. We were taking a trip to the first one was Sargent, Nebraska. That's when Mom went along. And Mike was born the next year, so she didn't go on the trip that next year. Anyway, got my hands cool, and the train was coming later in the day. It was during the summer, and I remember it was starting to get dark, so I think the train was like an overnight kind of thing. Getting out to Omaha was one of the first stops that we made, and then went on to Sargent, Nebraska. I recall this engine was here, but it might be a stretch. It may not have been. The choo-choo trains, as they were called, were really just was starting to go out of service quite often, or quite a bit, as they could be replaced with electric diesel. A diesel locomotive or electric diesel is actually, the diesel is burned to turn generators that make electricity, which then turn the wheels, because the wheels are electric. Anyway, Dale, my uncle, who was married to Nanty, or Lobabel Axetel, he was always a train enthusiast all of his life. Just kind of lived for him. And he worked on the railroad as an engineer in his latter years. He was an engineer. In his early years, he started out as a fireman, and firemen would stoke the fire in the engine and do other things. And so Of course, the railroads scrap a lot of these, or did back then, and a lot of them were just sited by railroad buildings, and there's a lot of them just in graveyards. There's a railroad graveyard out in Washington State, close to the Squamish ski resort. Squamish, I think, is the town. Anyway, there's a very, very large railroad graveyard there, which I'd been to. Building back there somehow avoided the wrecking ball, and so did this one right here on the right, where the windows are, nice windows are. People nowadays appreciate the look of history, or at least they're starting to anyway. This was the coal car, or for the most part, generally what they were called. They were not loaded with wood anymore, and they would also have to get water loaded into part of this tank, or into part of the coal car, and then the water would be fed to the engine, which would make steam, which would make the thing run. So Dale got me a job on my uncle Dale, Nancy's husband, Below the Bells, Axtel's husband, on the railroad in the summer of 1966. And I reported to work a few days late, of course. I thought that they were going to call me, but I was supposed to just show up. That's kind of the way the railroad was. They said, if you're hired, then just show up. And I thought, well, maybe they're going to call me, but they never did. So my uncle said, well, why haven't you been working? And said, they haven't called me. He said, well, they never do, so get over there. So that's what I did. And I worked all summer. For $2.50 an hour, which was pretty good money back then. All things being relative, a person could make $2.50 an hour today, and it would be a good living if it weren't for inflation. People cause inflation, and just to want for more money, more than other people are making, and that just has a snowballing effect, and eventually everybody's making $20, which is probably a decent wage now, an hour, and they're no better off than they were when they were making $2.50 an hour. So, go figure. Anyway, this is the end of this little vignette.